Started in about 30 seconds. Everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's summer school session on climate change and environmental law. My name is Madison Calhoun, and I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. We have a fantastic program lined up for you today, featuring Berge, Shelley, Welton, and Megan Berge, who will cover all things climate change from the international to the state and local level. Bud, Shelley, Megan, on behalf of ELI, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us. Before we get started, I want to let you know about our last few weeks of summer school. We're excited to announce that we're holding a summer school networking reception, which will be taking place next Monday from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time in Washington, D.C. With Baker Botts as our gracious host, we encourage you to come meet and network with fellow environmental law professionals, students, and experts. We'd love to see you there, and you can register through the ELI summer school page. We'll link it in the chat for you. The next day, we'll have our environmental justice session, which will be taking place in person at our Washington, D.C. office, and also will be live virtually. And then the following week after that, we'll be closing out summer school with our hazardous waste insights session, which will only be held via Zoom. We'll post the link to register for these last sessions in the chat, or you can find them on our website. Moving back to today's program, following the presentations, we'll be taking audience questions. So please submit any questions that you have throughout the program using Zoom's Q&A function. We encourage you to use the chat for any observations and comments you'd like to make throughout the program, but please be aware that we will be pulling discussion questions from the Q&A box, so please use that to get anything to our speakers. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted to the event webpage within a few business days. You can find the recording and register for future sessions of summer school at eli.org. And before we get started, I want to introduce you to our wonderful moderator. Guiding us through the next couple of hours will be Bud, who recently retired in 2023 after more than 15 years as founding editor of Yale Climate Connections. He spent nearly 5 decades in DC and Virginia as an environmental journalist and educator, the past 2 decades focusing exclusively on climate change. Here at ELI, Bud founded the Environmental Forum, our policy magazine, in 1982 and was editor during its first 4 years. He also worked as assistant director of Congress's National Commission on Air Quality under the Clean Air Act. Thank you, Bud, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And with that, I'll turn things over to you to get us started. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Madison. Thank you, Sarah. And my thanks to ELI. I've mentioned to you both that I have a fond spot in my heart for ELI from my 4 years there. It was critical to my long career in environmental journalism. I'd like to start with what I'll call a 10-minute, which means I'll probably go 15 minutes, a brief 10-minute, I'm going to call it the Cliff Notes version of climate change. So this is my interpretation of where we are before I introduce our distinguished 2 speakers. First of all, I want to emphasize to the audience something you may already know, and that is that this is a decades-long issue we're dealing with climate change, not only decades in the past, but decades into the future. My grandchildren, my great-grandchildren eventually, I dare to say your children, grandchildren, and the audience's children and grandchildren will be dealing with climate change for decades into the future. That's one point. I want to make another issue about climate change in particular, and that is that I believe it drives progress or lack of progress in all other environmental and resource issues. So if your interest is groundwater or urban runoff or any other issue in the environmental field under the major regulatory statutes, climate change is affected by them and affects them. So I maintain that we're not going to make a whole lot of progress with groundwater or with urban runoff or smog in LA or anything else unless and until we make progress also on climate. I suggest also that progress we make on those more local, that is more local than global, if you will, on those other issues, all those important environmental issues, also results in progress on climate. So the many environmental issues and climate change are symbiotic. What happens in one doesn't stay in one. It affects all the others and is affected by all the others. I want to say that the science on climate change over the decades that we've been at it has matured substantially. And I would maintain that there is now little or no peer-reviewed, evidence-based data suggesting other than, to quote Pogo, we've seen the enemy and it is us. That is, it is fossil fuels, it is largely carbon dioxide, and it is because of human emissions of carbon dioxide that we're experiencing and will continue to experience climate change. I am not suggesting there that all climate change is the result of human emissions. There's natural variability too. But the major causes of climate change and a warming planet over the past 5 or 6 decades is a result of human emissions, largely of carbon dioxide. I suggest that to the extent any evidence in science is proven, and that's a big word for science, it doesn't really apply, but this is as close to proven science as there can be. So the debate over science will continue, but for all practical purposes, in the peer-reviewed literature, it's over. It's done. I want to suggest to you that there are a couple short images I want to show to you. One is this one here. This is the overflowing bathtub metaphor. Scientists like this particular one because the water running high in the bathtub is good and positive until it gets to the point that it's a tipping point. So when the bathtub overflows, just like when the atmosphere overflows with too high a concentration of carbon dioxide, it turns a good thing into a bad thing. The second image I want to show to you is this. Now, this is going to be hard for you to see, but to find it on your own, just Google something like horse carriages to cars, New York, and this image will come up. Now, you may not be able to see it too well, but you can see they're both on Fifth Avenue in New York City, about 13 years apart. The one taken in 1900 and the second taken in 1913. So in the one on 1900, you may not be able to see it. This is not the best PowerPoint image here, but there is one auto among the horses and buggies at this time on Easter morning, 1900. Just 13 years later, same area basically shows just one horse and buggy and the rest ICE, industrial combustion engine vehicles. So this is representative of a fast transition from one major source of energy source to a second one just 13 years later. Amory Lovins first showed this presentation, this slide at a presentation where I had him speak to scientists and journalists. And this is a really helpful image, and he uses it to indicate that it is possible to transition quickly, 13 years, from one major energy source to another. That's what he says this image depicts. Now, Amory Lovins was also big on saying this. He told us repeatedly that the switch to renewable fuels is going to be fast, easy, and cheap. Fast, easy, and cheap. I would argue that it is none of the above. I would argue that it is not nearly as fast as Emery hoped it would be. I would suggest that it is not an easy transition by any stretch at all. And I would also suggest it is not cheap. It is not inexpensive, certainly not over the short run. Whether it proves to be over the long run remains to be seen. But I think Amory would not use that same prediction today, that the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy would be fast, easy, and cheap. I want to mention two well-known movies, popular movies, and not all of you will have seen both of these, I suggest. The first one I want to mention is The Graduate. I don't know how many of you in the audience have seen The Graduate, starring Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft. It was made in 1967. I was a junior in college in 1967. And there's a famous line from the Graduate that almost everyone of my generation, I dare say generation even a decade or 2 decades younger than me, know what I'm talking about. And that is the word plastics. Dustin Hoffman, the star of the show, was asked what he was wondering what to do with his career. And I think it was his father-in-law said, I have only one word to say to you. The word is plastics. Well, yep, somebody got it. Thank you, M.A. Delage, for saying that one word, plastics. If that movie were made today, I would suggest that the one-word response would be batteries. I'm going to mention more about batteries and storage of energy, but I would suggest that batteries are the new plastics of our current generation. I want to say that there's been enormous progress in controlling our fossil fuel emissions and moving toward a clean energy, society, both domestically, that is in the US, and also internationally. The progress has been astounding, and yet it is far, far, far from what is needed. The pace is much too slow in the transition if we really were to achieve the goals that have been set out by the Paris Climate Agreement 2015. So there's been much progress, many good things, not nearly enough. I want to mention another thing. Many of you have probably heard of the iconic figures 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. The goals are to achieve carbon dioxide concentrations not exceeding 1.5% above pre-industrial levels. Now, everyone in the climate science evidence community recognizes that we are not going to achieve that goal. We're going to reach and then go past the 1.5 goal, at which the Paris Climate Agreement scientists and IPCC, you'll hear more about them later, IPCC warned that the consequences get pretty serious. I would suggest that we probably are also going to exceed the 2 degrees centigrade standard. 2 degrees is probably not going to be achieved, not the ceiling. It's a floor now, but a goal is being a floor, but we're probably going to go right past 2 degrees. That's going to be a problem in climate communications because the scientific community has been very successful with the help of the environmentalist community in establishing 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade as goals. And we must reach those levels. We pretty much know now that we're not going to reach 1.5 for sure. And we're very, very likely not to stop below 2 degrees centigrade. The fact is that we'll probably zoom, not the best verb, but we'll probably pass 2 degrees centigrade. So there's going to be a problem when we get to that point, and even at the 1.5 degrees threshold sooner, there's probably going to be a problem because we will be seen by the popular person on the street as having exceeded the goal we all said we had to achieve. I think it's going to be important to redefine progress and success. I think every incremental percentage point of carbon dioxide not emitted to the atmosphere is going to be a cause for celebration. Because 2 degrees centigrade is going to be bad, but it's going to be a whole lot better than 2.1. And 2.1 is going to be better than 2.3 or 2.5. And 2.5 is going to be better than 2.5001. So each incremental percentage carbon dioxide not emitted, temperature increase not achieved, is going to be a cause for celebration, although not success. But it will be important to keep that in mind. So I think we're going to have to redefine victory and success as we continue this effort over the next several decades. In order to keep those concentrations, the percentage increases at some controllable level, some manageable level, we are going to have to resolve as a society and as a global society to keep, are you seated, trillions, not billions, not millions, but trillions of dollars of resources underground. That is a big order. That is a tough order for any capitalist society or for any wishing it were a capitalist society, seeking to be a more successful society for its people. But the truth is, we're going to have to leave trillions of dollars of valuable resources where they are and not combust them, not burn them. I mentioned progress. We've made great progress at the local level. We've made substantial progress at the national level. We've made significant progress at the international level. Again, not enough in any of those three, but all of them, and you'll hear more later, are important early signs of good progress. At the international, I want to emphasize, it's no surprise that the upcoming election will have profound impacts on how climate change is addressed in the US, whether it's addressed aggressively or whether it's addressed not at all or less aggressively. But don't overlook the significant changes going on overseas too, whether it's India or Germany or Italy or even France with its recent Pyrrhic victory, I guess you call it, for those wanting to address climate change. The UK appears to be on the continuing spectrum of wanting to address climate change seriously. Germany, perhaps less so, and that would be a big loss if Germany becomes less politically active on this issue. But there is, without doubt, a global rise in nationalism, in protectionism, and in moving somewhat away from fair trade, open and fair trade. So those transitions are going to be important, not just the US election by any stretch, but those transitions internationally, I think, are going to be very important. There's another thing to keep an eye on. One of the dilemmas is the progress toward a clean energy future is going to rely a lot on rare metals, not just traditional materials we can get virtually many places, but rare metals. Unfortunately, in particular for electric vehicles, rare metals are going to be critical. And they happen to be located in countries, in many cases, in countries that are not necessarily friendly to the US and not eager to trade its wealth in rare metals to us. So either it's not going to trade it at all, or it's going to trade us propose to trade us at very high expenses, costs to US to import. So we're talking about rare metals of lithium, other rare metals across the board. They happen to be in countries that are not warm, feeling good about the US for a whole bunch of reasons. But that's going to be another dilemma. The other point about going after rare metals, there's going to be a whole lot more mining across the world as we go toward getting rare metals and as we go toward moving toward a clean economy. Mining is seldom clean. It's seldom without its own emission problems. And unfortunately, underserved populations near those sites in distant countries are probably going to suffer health and environmental degradation. So we're probably going to have to destroy some local environments to get the rare metals we need to address the planetary environment and the atmospheric environment. So that's another challenge. There are lots of signals going on. The marketplace is moving in one direction. It may be irreversible in moving toward a low energy future, a clean energy future. I personally think it's going to be the dominant force in continuing whatever progress is made, not governments, but more the marketplace and economy, epitomized by nothing more than by the 90% decline in costs of solar energy over the past 10 or 15 years. And that decline has not stopped yet. That decline is going to continue for decades into the future. There are some troubling signs ahead. The environmentalist community celebrated when Hertz announced it was buying 20,000 electric vehicles. They weren't so celebratory when Hertz recently announced it's going to sell all its 20,000 electric vehicles because its customers no longer want them. And when they do get them as rental, they want to try and drive an EV. So they rent an EV from Hertz. When they did that, they found in many cases the mileage was not good. The charging stations were not sufficiently well spaced that they could use them. And in cold weather, they lost a lot of their zoom. So that the purchase of 20,000 vehicles by Hertz years ago was an important single image. The sale of it is just as important of a important single message. With that, again, Cliff Notes scan what I see at least as some of the current. Let me introduce both of our distinguished speakers. First, I'll introduce, and I'll have them speak in this order. It's Shelley Welton. Shelley is a Presidential Distinguished Professor of Law and Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, Carey Law School, and the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. Shelley teaches courses in energy policy, environmental law, and climate change law. She writes extensively on those topics of U.S. energy governance and climate change. Our second speaker is Megan Berge. Megan is a partner with Baker Botts LLP, a global law firm. Her practice involves representation of power companies, and she has extensive climate change and clean air practice among her other environmental practice and clients. So let me first introduce Shelley Welton. And Shelley, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bud, so much for that really sweeping and excellent introduction. I'm going to spend some time drilling down a little bit more into some of the trends that Bud was describing in terms of what's going on at both the international and domestic level. So let me see if I can get control of my slides. So I want to do just a few minor things with my time, which is first, do a quick description of the international framework that governs climate change, and then spend some time linking it to what's going on, some big trends in domestic federal climate change law. And then I'll just say a few words gesturing towards some of the same hurdles that Bud brought up for us in his remarks. So let's start with the international framework. Countries first got together and got really serious about climate change around 1992. And the international convention that they established then is often called the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Oh, it's skipping on me. Let's see. Okay. And they came up with what I think can be fairly described as like a solid but broad and amorphous objective, which was, let's stabilize atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations at a level where we're not going to have really dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. They didn't really get much more into the details of exactly how they were going to do it beyond that. But they did come up with one principle that was key to getting everyone's agreement. And that is this idea of what you'll often heard called as common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBD. And what this means is basically a recognition that obviously historic contributions to climate change have been very different. Countries are at very different levels of development. And common but differentiated is kind of a phrase that maybe like had quite different import for everyone involved, right? If you were a developed country, what you thought, I think you were getting out of this phrase is this acknowledgement that it can't just be developed countries. It's going to have to be developing countries too, because they're going to be the ones that emit more in the future. If you were a developing country, what you thought you were getting was an acknowledgement that, yeah, but those responsibilities are differentiated because we've been a lot less of the problem in the past and we still have a lot of need to grow. So we came up with this phrase, common but differentiated. Oftentimes in these international agreements, phrases phrases are agreed upon that people know they're going to fight about later. And that's what happened in this case. So it was time to go from this framework convention to something that actually started to make some real progress on climate change. And the first theory or way that we pursued this is through what was called the Kyoto Protocol. So this was originally adopted in 1997. It didn't enter into force until enough countries ratified it much later. And the idea here was to really lean into the differentiated responsibilities. So those countries that had already industrialized took on binding emissions limitations. They promised that they would cut their emissions an average of 5% from 1990 levels by the first compliance period, which was 2008 to 2012. And the agreement also put a bunch of mechanisms in place to give them some flexibility in how to do that. Basically, without going into gory detail, this approach failed pretty abysmally. The United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. The US Senate passed a resolution basically saying we will not agree to cuts unless all countries agree to cuts. Some of the countries that were not on target ended up pulling out. Canada pulled out. Some countries just kind of quietly didn't meet their targets. Japan didn't meet their target after the Fukushima disaster. So this approach that we'd taken initially didn't pan out. And so what you've seen in more recent years is a really different theory of how it is that we're going to try to achieve the international goal of 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, et cetera. And the latest really important agreement in this regard is the Paris Agreement, which was agreed to in 2015. And this basically throws out the idea that we're going to have binding targets for some countries and not binding targets for others. Instead, the way that the Paris Agreement is structured, every country brings to the table basically their promise to the world in the form of what's called a nationally determined contribution. So you set your own targets, you set your own contribution, you present a document telling the world what it is that you're going to achieve. And the idea is that over time, as countries make promises and keep promises, and we do what are called global stock takes to evaluate how all of the promises are going, trust should build, countries should start to ratchet up their ambition, and eventually we'll build sort of like a system of mutual trust where we're on track to hit the targets. A big part of preserving common but differentiated responsibilities under this new agreement that doesn't make clear distinctions in terms of pledges is this idea that the developed world will provide considerable financing to help the developing world meet its targets. The original pledge was 100 billion. It's been really, really difficult to muster that amount of financing, which is something we can talk about more if you all want to. Okay, so here's the theory today of how we, as a globe, come together and try to tackle this problem. We have countries make pledges, and then we amalgamate those pledges. And over time, we hope that the pledges will get us to where we need to go. I pulled up a chart here. This is from the United Nations Environmental Program. And this is their recent stock take of how things are going under this new Paris approach. It's a little bit busy of a chart, but I want to just spend a minute on it together. So here's timeline at the bottom. And here's gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent over here, right? So one thing you'll see is that they've charted a line of how quickly emissions need to get reduced to either hit 1.5 or hit 2, with a range of uncertainty. And then up here is where we are. So here is the current policy scenario in blue. This is if all the countries just do the policies that they already have enacted, here's where we are. Here is where we get based on what are called unconditional NDC pledges. So if all the countries do what it is that, let me just step back and say, unconditional NDCs means that a country says, no matter what other countries promise and do, here's what I'm going to do. Conditional NDCs are when countries write into their NDC some sort of conditionality that basically says, like, look, I'll also go and do more things if other countries similarly promise to do them, right? So conditional NDCs basically require countries making good on their pledges in order to basically like activate further actions by other countries. So if countries do everything that they've promised in their NDCs, either unconditionally or conditionally, we still have a pretty enormous gap in terms of where we need to go, right? So the theory of Paris is that hopefully the initial stock take that just happened will increase the ambition of targets going forward. So we start to sort of bend this line down further, but we're not there yet. And part of the challenge is that you can only get so far ahead of domestic politics in your NDC and have your pledge be credible. So I want to spend the rest of my time focusing on how the US has come up with its pledge and what it's doing to try to make that pledge credible and legible to the world so that everybody will come and ratchet up their pledges in the future. Okay, so when the US put in its NDC under the Biden administration, what they promised is that we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. And this is roughly in line with what scientists say we would need to do to hit somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees, right? It would set us on a potential plausible trajectory for having net zero emissions around the year 2050, which is what models suggest that we will need. Okay, so then how do you get there? If you have this NDC, you've told the world this is what you're going to do. It requires domestic action to then go out and make your NDC a reality. So I want to spend the rest of the time talking about a few ways that the United States is trying to make its NDC a reality. So here's just a list of like plausible tools at a very high level that I jotted down that you might use to try to achieve your NDC. You can use federal statutes, regulations under those statutes, and executive orders. I'm going to spend my time just talking about these two things in yellow. There's a huge universe of things to cover, and Megan's going to spend some time talking about some of these other tools. You can use state analogs of statutes and regulations. You can hope that your corporations or private actors will voluntarily undertake some activities, even if it's not required by law. And then we've seen a fair bit of litigation to try to accelerate all of these other tools that I have on the list. And I'll just note here, I just put up the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So you can start to get a sense of like when it's time to tackle and cut emissions in half, what sectors are we looking towards? Transportation is now our largest emitting sector. Electric power is a close second. And then you see industry, industrial uses, residential and commercial uses, and agriculture rounding out the picture. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm just going to talk about a snapshot of a few statutes and regulations that are driving the US approach to climate change. And basically, when it comes to using statutes, I'm oversimplifying a little, but there's really two tactics, right? One is you can take some statutes that you already have on the books and you can try to adapt them to use them to address climate change. Or the other thing you can do is pass some new laws to try and tackle climate change. Obviously, there's political and legal hurdles to both of these. So I thought I would talk about just two biggies when it comes to this theory of using older statutes for new purposes. One is the Clean Air Act, which is probably the most obvious place to think about tackling climate. And the other is the National Environmental Policy Act. And then I'm going to talk about just the biggest new statute that's come out for trying to make good on this US climate pledge, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. So let me spend just a few minutes doing kind of like a high-level preview of what's been going on recently under these statutes. I can't possibly cover their full history or all of the like sort of interesting legal ins and outs that they've hit as they've tried to do this, but maybe you'll find this interesting enough to take environmental law or climate change law and get the full coverage there. Okay, so let's start with the Clean Air Act, sort of like the biggest, the most obvious place to look to try to tackle air pollution coming from greenhouse gases. So a blockbuster case in 2007 coming out of the US Supreme Court, Massachusetts versus EPA, firmly established that greenhouse gases count as air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, which basically like kicked into place a whole bunch of requirements for the EPA to figure out how to regulate them. Now, the Clean Air Act covers both stationary and mobile sources, which is to say it covers both the transportation sector and the electric power and industrial sectors. So it has the potential to really hit at a lot of the big sources of emissions. And the EPA has targeted both as it's gone after greenhouse gas pollution. So let's talk first about mobile sources. Clean Air Act, climate, and cars. Here is the statement that the Biden-Harris administration put out this spring when it put in place the most ambitious regulations to date to try to tackle emissions from cars, right? So they say, It's going to position US companies and workers to lead the clean vehicle future, protect public health, address the climate crisis, and save drivers money. What's not to like? So the way that these standards work is they basically require auto manufacturers to meet a certain average level of fuel economy. And they can do that through a bunch of different technologies. But like fundamentally, the key driver here is going to be that you're going to have to sell a certain amount of electric cars in order to be able to meet these standards. Basically, by 2032, I think the calculation is that around by 2032, it's going to have the amount of auto emissions. And the core strategy for getting there is to sell some zero emissions vehicles that you can then average with whatever other vehicles you're selling. So this has been attacked as a ban on internal combustion engines. It's not a ban, but it is functionally going to require a shift in the kinds of cars that manufacturers are able to sell and still meet these standards. This has already been subjected to lawsuits by many states that say it's an unreasonable standard. I'm sure we're going to see many more going forward. Okay, so the second biggie category that the EPA has tried to hit under the Clean Air Act is power plants. And gosh, have these regulations had a tortured history. The first effort to do this happened under the Obama administration. The Trump administration put out its own rules. All of those ended up getting struck. And the Biden administration, just this spring again, finalized its version of how it thinks we should regulate climate under the Clean Air Act when it comes to power plant emissions. I'm going to get just a little bit technical here because I think it's helpful to know these details as you look at some of the litigation coming down the pike. So the way that the Clean Air Act establishes the parameters of regulating power plants is it tells the EPA that it should establish, I'm quoting here, standards of performance for categories of stationary sources, in this case power plants, based on what's called the best system of emissions reduction adequately demonstrated. There was a blockbuster Supreme Court case 2 years ago that basically said, whatever system means here, it doesn't mean that the EPA can go in and tell utilities that they have to switch to renewable energy. So that strategy is out. So what you saw the Biden administration do in spring 2024 was pivot to a different strategy. And basically what they've done is said, okay, well, if we can't change system-wide emissions, which would be the most cost-effective way to do this, then we're going to put some technological requirements on the types of power plants that still emit fossil fuels. And so they basically come in and said, if you're a coal plant that plans to keep running for the long term, and if you're a new natural gas plant that's getting ready to be built, you're going to have to put carbon capture and storage technology on your facility. We can get into technical details if you all want to, under certain conditions, basically, if you're going to run a lot and you're going to run for a long time. Now, this sets up a very interesting case for SCOTUS review because the question is going to be, is carbon capture and storage, the best system of emissions reduction, adequately demonstrated, or is it still too new of a technology to fill this role? So I'll just say, I think there's going to be an epic battle to come. Stay tuned on this front. Okay. I also wanted to just say a word about another statute that gets a little less play on the climate front, but I think is coming in for a really interesting series of debates at present. And that's the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So NEPA's sort of big move in the environmental space is to require federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of proposed major federal actions significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. Those are all technical, much litigated phrases. What I want to highlight here is just the complexity of the relationship between climate change and the requirements of NEPA. On the one hand, you would hope that this requirement to do a dive into proposed actions will get agencies to really think hard about the climate impacts that actions that they permit may have, and ideally, hopefully, figure out some ways to limit the climate impacts of whatever it is, whatever actions the federal government is taking. On the other hand, NEPA has come in for a lot of criticism recently because it often is used to halt infrastructure. And when that infrastructure was highways and coal-fired power plants and a lot of other things that environmentalists like sort of traditionally viewed as bad for the environment, that was one thing, but now it's being used to halt wind, solar, transmission development, a lot of things that are going to happen for the clean energy transition to proceed as quickly as it needs to. Now, there's a lot of empirical debate about just how big a problem NEPA is for this kind of infrastructure versus other kinds of statutes, but I thought I would just highlight this debate is out there swirling as to how much laws that like have a lot of procedural hoops to jump through are now a real impediment to the clean energy transition. And I'll just say Biden has basically tried to like navigate these two different tensions with NEPA, with actions that the administration has taken. So a statute passed in 2023 basically tried to speed NEPA up a little bit by putting in place page limits and time limits on NEPA analyses. Whether this works, I think, is an open question, given that people can still litigate and the analysis might just be less robust that they're now litigating to try to attack. And then they've also put in place a score of new requirements this spring that basically like try to illuminate how agencies should consider climate change and, you know, cases in which they should really be trying to quantify the greenhouse gas impacts of their actions. Again, this is a live debated issue. Looking ahead, I think I wanted to highlight two things coming forward. So amidst all of the other things that the Supreme Court did last month, it granted cert to a case that is litigating basically the bounds of what NEPA analysis requires. So stay tuned for that. I think we'll have a pretty blockbuster NEPA case on the court's docket next term. And then there's still permitting reform conversations swirling in Congress, basically trying to figure out like just what is slowing clean energy infrastructure down and how could some sort of bipartisan compromise be reached that might accelerate the pace of infrastructure development. Okay, so that's the two biggie federal statutes, use of old federal statutes to tackle the climate problem that I wanted to highlight. And then I want to spend just a minute talking about the one big climate statute that has been passed in recent years. So we've seen a lot of failed climate legislation over the past couple of decades until the Inflation Reduction Act, which eked out sort of like the barest of victories in the US Congress in the summer of 2022. The IRA is a really different theory of how to get emissions reductions than the sort of classic pollution control kinds of measures that you see in a statute like the Clean Air Act. And its basic theory is instead of focusing on tamping down, you know, the bads, tamping down emissions from sources, let's just make it really, really enticing for people to build new clean energy sources. So the sort of the core building blocks of the Inflation Reduction Act are big tax credits to clean energy developers for all stripes of clean energy, and then tax credits to households for taking steps to make their households run on electricity, which ideally will then be powered by clean energy because of the other tax cuts. So for things like electrifying heating, purchasing electric vehicles, et cetera. And then some grants as well to help households, cities, and states transition those who can't really avail themselves of tax credits, and particularly low-income communities. So we can talk more about the IRA. I'm not going to say more about it for present purposes, except to highlight that it is really bending the curve of US emissions. So again, here, a slightly complicated chart, but here we're back at that same timeline. This is reductions of emissions by percentages. And I'll just note one interesting fact, which is that starting in 2005, down through the mid-2020s, US emissions have already been falling pretty rapidly. But this is a story that's like, it's a silver lining, but maybe with like still a whole lot of, I don't know, emissions floating from it, because the main reason that emissions have fallen so far is that the United States had a huge boom in hydraulic fracturing, and we've transitioned largely from coal to natural gas in the electricity sector. That brings emissions down, depending on how much we trust that methane emissions aren't actually making gas closer to coal than we think. But it's not a long-term solution for getting all the way to zero, right? Because natural gas is still a fossil fuel. So under the Inflation Reduction Act, basically what you see is a bending of the curve even further downward from where we already were based on this transition to gas. This is where we would have been without the Inflation Reduction Act. This is approximately the trajectory that modelers suggest we'll be on with it. I've added a dot here just to show that we are still not at the US NDC level of emissions reductions, right, which is 50% by 2030. But we're starting to get closer, right? All of these kinds of actions accrete and help the US begin to be able to make good on its pledge to, make a scientifically reasonable contribution to reducing climate change. Okay, the last thing I thought I'd do is just highlight super briefly 2 headwinds. And I'm not going to say a lot about these, but we can talk about them more in the Q&A if you all want to. All right, one is that the Supreme Court's recent term ended with a bunch of bangs that suggest a proclivity to be shrinking the power of the administrative state and deference to the administrative state. In particular, Chevron died an ignominious death last month in these 2 decisions, Loper Bright and Relentless, that basically said, we're not going to sort of automatically defer to any reasonable agency interpretation of a statute, which in the case of climate means that when you're trying to use these old statutes to tackle new problems, you basically have less space in which to do that. And then, I think Bud covered this well. There are exceedingly disparate visions and plans on the table for where the United States heads on climate change based on the results of the November election. So I think everything that I have talked about thus far is pretty much up in the air. Okay, I will end there and turn it back over to Bud. Thank you all so much. Look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Shelley, so much. That was outstanding. That was applause from my timer, but outstanding job, Shelley. Let's now turn to Megan Berge. As I mentioned earlier, she's a partner with Baker Botts. I believe she's headquartered in the West Coast, but I may be wrong about that. Is that correct, Megan?
Yeah, I spent 12 years in DC before moving out to the great state of California, where I am currently live and work.
Why don't you take it from there, Megan? Eager to hear your presentation.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bud and Shelley, for really setting the table for this. And the way to look at it is we're starting at big picture policy, moving into where that policy sits here in the United States at a federal level. And I am betting cleanup to talk a little bit today about how that policy then makes its way down to the states. So something I want to be very clear with here is that the states are actually incredibly active on the issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of debate going on and a lot of activity among and between the states in terms of exactly how to address this. One thing I thought was really helpful, Shelley, was that circle, the pie chart you put up with the sectors of emissions. You mentioned industry, agriculture, transportation, residences, which is really buildings in a lot of ways, and the power sector. And what you can see here in this table is just an example of the myriad ways, and there are more than this, depending on which state you're in. States are going about actually enacting statutes and regulations that try to tackle these various sectors. So just by way of example, when you talk about buildings, which are homes, businesses, are as-built environment, we've got things from energy efficiency codes. So how do you weatherize? What is really, can you do with the building envelope? What type of windows? Things along those lines. Building emission performance standards, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on. This is where various states and localities are setting budgets for buildings just as though they were a power plant or other major emission source and requiring reductions. Codes that are considered all electric or electric ready. These are famously what gave rise to the litigation in Berkeley related to gas stove bans. And that is where when you build new buildings, they can only use electric appliances. And then gas appliance prohibitions. And this is unique right now to California, where certain air quality management districts are actually passing regulations that are called no NOx standards. And while you might say, hey, Megan, NOx is not a greenhouse gas pollutant, that is true, but they are also being passed pursuant to CARB's greenhouse gas authority here in California, because when you eliminate the NOx, go to zero NOx, you also go to zero greenhouse gases. So that's things like saying you cannot have a certain commercial gas cooking appliance or another type of gas appliance in your home, whether that's space, water heating. Recently, they passed a law phasing out forklifts, they have to be all electric. Then we move on to vehicles. And here's what's interesting is when you look at a lot of what Shelley covered at the federal level, some of those ideas really are fundamentally entwined with what's going on at the states. And that's particularly true in the transportation sector. There's a long history that if you do actually take a climate or environmental law class at your law school, I am sure they will cover. California would like to tell everyone that it had a Clean Air Act before the federal government had a Clean Air Act. And one of the key parts of that was regulating vehicles. California has regulations mandating zero emission vehicle requirements. So well beyond what's currently required by the federal government. Those laws are actually preempted unless and until California gets a waiver from the federal government. So this is a unique aspect of the Clean Air Act. But again, something very specific that's going on at the state level, and there's wrinkles where they can be adopted by other states, but that is a lot of detail to get into today. You can do an entire class, and I'm setting my timer right now to keep myself on track, just on the vehicle sector and the intersection between the Clean Air Act and state requirements. Another sector that's highly targeted, as Shelley said, I enjoyed your discussion of, third time's the charm on the various phases that we've gone through with power plant regulations for greenhouse gases. One thing that's interesting is before there were emission rate standards at the federal government level for combustion turbines, for example, Washington State has actually had a greenhouse gas performance standard for both new and existing gas turbines for, almost 10 years. So it was in place before the Obama administration sort of took up the mantle and decided to promulgate greenhouse gas emission rates. Similarly, something that folks really don't pay a lot of attention to is the fact that these policies are not just quote unquote blue state issues. North Dakota is actually leading the way on carbon capture requirements and has put in place laws that actually mandate certain percentages of carbon capture on their electric fleet. So we're really seeing things pop up on the power sector, and we'll get into that with some of the examples. Locomotives, so trains. California, again, has a zero emission locomotive requirement that's currently being promulgated. Electricity service, and I did break this out from the power sector because there's pieces of that that deal with actual regulations at the plant in terms of what is coming out of a fossil fuel stack versus electricity writ large on the grid. States tend to look at this in terms of clean electricity standards or renewable portfolio standards. Gas service, so again, talking about how you get the energy that fuels your home or your business. There's also things like upstream methane requirements. So again, the federal government recently, as part of the efforts that Shelley was talking about to implement some of the international agreements, there's a federal requirement to reduce upstream extraction of fossil fuels and methane emissions. But there are actually multiple states that had those requirements in place beforehand. So for example, Colorado and New Mexico both had regulations for their oil and gas sector addressing methane emissions. Another thing that we're seeing is in terms of gas service when it gets to your house, multiple states, Virginia, Minnesota, for example, have gas innovation acts, which require your gas utility to consider a range of options in terms of how to reduce emissions. A lot of these in the form of energy efficiency or other measures. Sometimes these are called clean heat plans if you're in Vermont or Colorado. Transportation fuel, and you could have said, well, why isn't that in the vehicles? And it's because transportation fuel is more broadly, should be considered more broadly. So this is low carbon fuel standards. So that's what is the carbon intensity of what is going in your vehicle. And I do want to stop here just really quickly to note, there is a fundamental difference in these various programs that you'll see. There's end use emissions, meaning what is coming out of the stack or the pipe or the appliance or whatever that end use combustion is. And then there's the way to look at it for life cycle. And when you're talking about life cycle, you're really going, what is the carbon intensity overall of this particular fuel or this appliance or whatever it is you're analyzing. And sometimes people tend to mix apples and oranges in terms of talking about these two concepts, but various state programs, and even at the federal level, you see this echoed, really are targeting different ways or places to get emission reductions in the economy or the value chain, depending on whether they're targeting end-use combustion-based emissions or if they're targeting life cycle emissions of the product or fuel. The transportation fuel, because it's hard to physically ensure that the relevant molecule is going into the car or into the pump, does it on a carbon intensity basis. So that really goes to motor vehicles, but this can also, depending on the state and what the program looks like, affect what goes into farm equipment. Basically, all kinds of things that move can be impacted by the transportation fuel requirements. And right now in California, they're considering whether or not to include planes in this low carbon fuel standard mix. In terms of economy-wide, and I tried to figure out what to call sort of these big programs that are not trying to tackle a specific targeted sector, cap and trade programs. California obviously was leading the way in this in 2006 when it passed AB 32, which established the first US-based cap and trade program, which was implemented then in 2012, followed up by Washington, and now potentially New York and Quebec. We're not focused on non-US, or at least I'm not focused in my section on non-US based programs, but Quebec also has a cap and trade program that's actually linked with California's. So, and the other thing that is new, very new in terms of this last week, is something called a climate superfund law. So normally I would ask for a show of hands to see how familiar you all are in terms of Superfund type laws. We've been told by ELI that that's been part of other summer school programs, but these state laws are interesting because they take that same concept and are applying it to climate. And then finally, refrigeration. So again, the as-built environment. One of the things that's very interesting is this is another place where you have that connection with the Clean Air Act, or this overlay with the Clean Air Act, but the states actually led the way. In 2020, the AIM Act was passed, which was aimed at giving EPA new authorities to phase out hydrofluorocarbons, which are a potent greenhouse gas emission. But various states, including California and others as early as 2018, and possibly predating that, actually began passing local regulations to phase out this refrigerant in various uses. And HFCs are in any number of pieces of equipment. They're everything from, spray bottles, bear spray, for example, refrigeration at grocery stores, very widespread pollutant. But again, this is a place where states really started leading the way on the regulation, and then the federal government came up behind. Okay, so what are some of the wrinkles for the state programs? Because I realized I just went through an absolute litany of ways that the various ways that the states are going about tackling the need to, or the desire to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions within their footprint. What are some of the challenges that they tend to face, or why is this not a perfect solution to addressing perfect solution to this regulatory issue? And really it comes down to the fact that we are a patchwork. And so once you look at that litany of programs I mentioned, I just want to do some vocabulary exercises to give you an example of what we're really talking about in terms of instruments that are in play, or that you have to figure out how these things connect. So real quick, running through the list, these programs involve renewable thermal credits. So renewable thermal credit represents reductions in carbon intensity of natural gas. So if you're saying I'm reducing my natural gas by blending in, for example, renewable natural gas RNG, which is a biomethane or synthetic methane, you would say I can get that certified as a renewable thermal credit and then account for that when I'm reporting the carbon intensity of my natural gas sales. Renewable energy credits. This is a very similar concept, and honestly the one that most people are more familiar with in terms of RECs or RECs. is what you may have seen them called. They represent reductions in carbon intensity of electricity. Typically what they mean is the amount of renewable electricity that's been put on the grid. Allowances. Famously, credits and allowances tend to get mixed up. Offsets and allowances tend to be mixed up. Allowances are really a function of a cap and trade program because they are literally what they sound like. They allow an emission of greenhouse gas, and they are a permit to emit, for example, 1 metric ton of CO2. And these are part of cap and trade programs. So there's auctions, people buy allowances, they are then used to cover the emissions budget that a various source is emitting. Again, that type of program is really going after that end use at the stack combustion. LCFS credits, low carbon fuel standard credits, these represent a metric ton reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from a transportation fuel. But again, it's looking over the life cycle, and there's some very complicated models called the GREET model. And California, for example, for their low carbon fuel standard, which was again the first one established in the country, has a whole system around getting a pathway certified to certify these reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from that transportation fuel, with different values being given to different types of fuels or different ways of making that reduction. And just to add some color to that, because I'm realizing that might not crystallize in your mind, it's, for example, if you have an ethanol plant that's making a biofuel to be blended in to fossil transportation fuel, that may get you a certain number of credits. But then if you put carbon capture and sequestration on that ethanol plant, thus reducing the carbon intensity overall that comes into that biofuel, you then will be eligible for more credits under the system, and your fuel that you're supplying will actually have more value, because for every volume of that fuel that's blended in, you're displacing more greenhouse gas emissions, or you're reducing greenhouse gas footprint. The last one is offsets. Offsets are famous. They are actually not part of any particular legal regime outside of a cap and trade program. And even there's a complicated way under the Washington and California program to then convert certain and limited offsets into allowances so they can be used in the actual existing regime. Typically, when we're talking about offsets, this is really an issue around voluntary reductions. And I appreciated Shelley going through the various mechanisms by which to achieve greenhouse gas reduction goals, and one of them being a voluntary reduction mechanism. There is not a federally endorsed or state endorsed framework for regulating offsets, to many folks' chagrin, and to a lot of writing and policy debate. There is a lot of effort right now on the international level to create some sort of consistency among the varying frameworks. But for now, here in the US, the only place that offsets really come into a regulated mechanism is when they're being transitioned into allowances into our cap and trade programs. So as you look at these programs, and if you do decide to take a climate change program at your school, what you'll see is you may hear people talking about RTCs, or renewable thermal credits, RECs for electricity, allowances, LCFS credits, offsets, and then talking about tax credits from the IRA. And a lot of what you do if you sit in my shoes in private practice is helping people figure out how to stack, or how these programs work together, and what their product is eligible for, or what deficit or obligations it creates, or what benefits it creates. So lots of moving pieces when you're talking about how our state programs really fit together. Another big problem that the state faces are emissions leakage. What do I mean by leakage? It is literally what it sounds like, is that when you take your footprint as a state and you say, okay, I'm going to reduce this certain emission, I'm going to squeeze it down, does the regulated entity simply transfer to state lines? Or in some instances, if you're talking about a trade exposed industry, does that business simply go out of business in the US and move to being produced in China? You see this a lot in certain building materials that we see here, or that we use here in the US. A lot of it gets outsourced to other countries. Do those emissions simply leave your state such that you've successfully reduced them in your state, but then just moved out of state. This was a big concern of a lot of folks when we were first seeing cap and trade programs being set up, and it led to, on the East Coast, a cap and trade program that's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And the goal, that's a block of about 13. It occasionally changes as states join or rejoin, a block of approximately 13 states that have joined together to do an electricity only, so not economy wide, but an electricity only cap and trade program. And one of the big questions was, if the block is not big enough, do the emissions simply move from, for example, you shut down a power plant or a fossil power plant in your state, and now you just demand more electricity from out of state and emissions go up in a state outside of that footprint. So emissions leakage has been a really challenging part of this conversation when you're talking about a patchwork way of doing regulations on a state-by-state basis. Another big wrinkle that we're hitting, and I did appreciate Bud talking about the sheer cost of what it is going to cost to retool and change or think through our existing infrastructure and how we can reuse it or what needs to be replaced, is the cost to residents and businesses. Because at the end of the day, none of this is free. And so when you're talking about how do I, if your goal is to send certain price signals or to actually transition something out of a home or a business, how do I then make that cost relatively affordable for someone on a fixed income or someone at a lower income level, or even your average working class home who may not have an extra $5,000 to upgrade their HVAC system just laying around. So that's when we talked about the IRA tax credits. That was a big focus of some of those acts as well, but the sheer scope or enormity is, the IRA is a drop in the bucket. We'll just put it there. So there's a lot of cost impacts, even when you talk about your energy sector. So if you're not talking about something that specifically has to happen at your home, those costs on your utility services, how you get energy, they go up. When you say that you have to take an existing resource that's currently affordable or somewhat paid off and economical, and you have to reduce it and substitute a new source, whether that's batteries or something that might be more expensive, then all of a sudden you are looking at fundamentally changing what your cost when you pay your electric bill every month looks like. And one of the things that has been most successful, in my opinion, and actually goes to that shift in how you look at how do you drive innovation, is these tax credit concepts. Because something that went forward during the Obama administration was a production tax credit for wind, and then later a similar tax credit for solar that drove down some of the costs for developers to actually bring those resources online. Now, that story does get more complicated. Nothing about this is simple when you start looking at where some of those materials are manufactured and how much we're importing from other countries who maybe do not have the same environmental regulations when they are constructing those materials that then we use here in the US. So again, getting back to just a different form of leakage, but far more than I can cover in 25 minutes today, and a far bigger problem that frankly, we don't necessarily have easy answers to. Other issues that are facing states when they do try to act and sort of their barriers is disconnects in legal authority. The layers on which we currently have regulated utilities, unregulated utilities, manufacturer sales, differences in authorities between preempted authorities where they have to be addressed by the federal government versus what has been left to the states in various sectors. These things don't always work together. So even if a state passes a sweeping bill, what they may find is that there are still vestiges or pieces that have to be hammered out in sort of in determining how these legal mechanisms work together. So I thought what would be helpful is for the remaining time is to just give a couple of examples of these state programs, and then I will be jumping over to the Q&A section of this, and I do want to make sure we leave sufficient time, so I will try to move through this in short order. So First of all, cap and trade programs. What will be interesting about this is we have California has a long established cap and trade program. It currently faces criticism from some individuals as being seen as too successful and not now stringent enough. I am not adopting, to be clear, I am not adopting any of these positions I'm about to articulate. I am simply stating some of the policy debates that have gone on. Washington State has passed California is linked with a similar program in Quebec. And the idea that you would just create two cap and trade programs and instantly link them, I want to emphasize how challenging and what a big undertaking it was to figure out how two separate programs in two different economies and state economies would work together. So that's quite of an achievement that we do now have the California-Quebec market. Washington passed the Climate Commitment Act in 2021 and had its first year with allowance auctions last year in 2023. So they are up and running. And there's actually an open comment period right now, if anyone's interested, on how to link Washington now with the California-Quebec program. At one point, it looked like Oregon was going to pass cap and trade legislation. There was a famous news stories that you can Google where some of the legislatures in Oregon actually left the state and went to Idaho and other places to avoid the legislature being able to get a quorum so that the cap and trade legislation to pass, which then led to subsequent legislation in the state saying that if you do that, you cannot then run for office again. So open question on whether Oregon will then take up cap and trade in future sessions, thus allowing a possibility of a West Coast linkage and an entire West Coast cap and trade block. So lots of movement, really creating momentum on that front. New York passed a law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019, that created a variety of new drivers in terms of the electric sector and other obligations. They are now in the process of establishing a cap and trade program under that statute and have begun considering whether or not the goal of that program would be then to link with California, Quebec, or California, Quebec, Washington. And this idea of linkage is actually really important. So I just want to pause on that for a minute. One of the key challenges for passing a cap and trade program or a market-based mechanism is getting to sufficient scale such that the economy has places where they can efficiently reduce emissions and free up allowances to flow to places where it's harder to reduce emissions, and then gradually move to reducing the less of the low-hanging fruit over time. If you don't have sufficient scale, there's not enough elasticity and liquidity in the market, and the costs are too high, and the end users and the ultimate, all of us on this phone, end up with not sustainable program mechanisms. So linkage is really important, and I have high hopes for Washington and California and Quebec being able to get over the finish line in the next year or so. Okay, other economy-wise, this climate superfund bill, and to be totally honest, this is so new. It was passed just about a month ago by Vermont, is the first state that has signed this into law. Essentially what the concept is that there will be cost recovery demanded for certain entities that have been defined in the statute as responsible parties. The money will then be used for adaptive infrastructure projects. So if I had the bucket of looking at end use emissions, looking at life cycle emissions, this is really a pivot to looking at adaptation versus a program aimed at emissions reductions. So if you say, I have a program that I want to reduce end use emissions, I have a program where I want to reduce life cycle emissions because I recognize that it might be a harder to decarbonize end use sector. This bucket goes to, okay, we are feeling impacts. How do we adapt to them or get the funding to adapt to them? And that's what this bill is really aiming to address. It doesn't require any specific reductions. It requires essentially what under the federal Superfund law analogy would be a cleanup payment, is an adaptation measure fund. There are a lot of legal questions that are going to come up. related to and about this particular statute. No litigation has been filed yet. I can't imagine that it won't be at some point. But one of the issues here is, how do you regulate or reach these responsible parties under this statute? And how the state appears to be attempting to deal with it is saying that essentially it's a responsible party is a party defined over a certain emissions level, and then also with sufficient connection to satisfy the US requirements of the Constitution. Meaning, I am not a state that is extraterritorially regulating. I am only tagging or reaching out to companies that have a sufficient nexus to my state such that personal jurisdiction would be satisfied. So for all of you who are wondering why Civ Pro matters, civil procedure is a critical class that you're taking in law school along with admin law. And it will come up whether your particular focus is environmental or on another hook. So theoretically, the payment will be calculated proportionate for all parties. These laws have actually been introduced in a number of states. It passed in New York, but has not yet been signed into law. It has been signed into law in Vermont. Unclear if other states will follow. These laws are not self-implementing, so passing the law is really just the first step. There's an entire regulatory implementation process, that's that admin law part I mentioned, where the state will have to go forward and enact key definitions and figure out how they're actually going to implement this. Okay, that's my timer telling me that I'm to the end. One other thing I really want to mention is climate disclosure laws. If I did a show of hands of people who have heard about the SEC regulation that they just issued, I'm sure everybody has seen it in the news. If you are on this call, you are probably interested in climate change. Something that's important to note is California, again, has gotten out in front of this issue. And in some ways, the California disclosure laws are much broader than the SEC. The SEC laws only focus on publicly traded companies. The California law requires disclosures, including scope 3 emissions for certain entities above a threshold for both public and private companies. So if you meet the criteria, you are going to be forced to report. But there are open questions again, because once you enact legislation, there's then the follow-on requirement here for SB 253 and 261, where CARB, the climate regulator here in California, will have to go through rulemaking to determine how some of these key definitions play out. What does it mean to be doing business in California? Because again, going back to that list of wrinkles for a state is the fact that you are limited to regulating within your borders. Okay, I will pause there instead of going into AB 1305, but there's other examples in the deck if people have questions about what some of these state-focused programs look like. So Bud, over to you.
Great job, Megan. I'm fascinated to hear about the Climate Superfund law. And although it's brand new, I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more about it. I'd like to take license and put each of us presenters, if you will, on the spot with a question that hopefully is very down to earth and very practical. The question is this, and if Shelley and Megan prefer, I'll take this deep dive first to answer it, not comfortably, because it's a tough question. But if they'd like to go first, I'll certainly defer to either one of them. The question is a simple question. The answer may not be so simple. Have you decided whether in your case or your family's case, now is a good time or a bad time to buy an EV, an electric vehicle? Who wants to go first?
I can go first.
Shelley?
So I am currently carless and we just moved to the suburbs and I like deeply, deeply want to resist getting a car, but I think it's going to be hard. And so this question has actually been super front of mind for me recently. And I guess, I mean, I think it's tricky, right? I think the reason that it's a tricky question is that the technology is evolving rapidly and probably EVs are going to be much more affordable in the United States within a few years. Yes, I would like to bicycle. I have a wonderful electric bike, but Philly is like death for bicycles to try to get from the suburbs into Penn. I care about my life too much to do that right now. We have some work to do on bike lanes in a serious way. Okay. I think costs are going to come down a lot. I think infrastructure is going to improve rapidly in terms of being able to charge cars on road trips in the next 5-ish years. And I guess where I end up is that, like, I think there's a spectrum of who should be a first adopter and who maybe has like good reasons to wait. And I think that it would be, my husband has a car, so it would be a second car for our family, and Penn pays me a generous enough salary that I feel like I should be a first mover. And even if I think that cars will improve and technology will improve and it's prudent for many to wait, I shouldn't wait. That said, I think that, you know, if you're a student contemplating a car that feels like a stretch of the budget, I could see why somebody might wait.
Great answer, Shelley. Megan, how about you all?
So I think it's a complicated question. And one thing I should say to everyone on this call is I'm actually a military spouse and my husband's active duty. So we move around a fair bit. And I will tell you, my perspective on this was different when I lived in DC, where we also had an electric bike. And that was my main way of getting to and from work if I was not able to take the metro, and we were a one-car family for years. And then my husband moved to a remote base in the middle of the Mojave Desert for 3 years, where there was nothing. Like, I was actually happy if I saw a gas station, and I'm not exaggerating. So the idea that I would have had an EV in that locality is just, I frankly think it would have been unsafe, simply because I would have to drive 4 hours to an airport through the Mojave Preserve. And I always made sure I had a full tank of gas before I did so. So it is really different where you live. And I've talked to folks who, you know, they may live in really remote cold climates and they feel very strongly about not having an EV. For my family personally, we have had Priuses. We've had hybrids since 2007, and they've been a really effective car for us. And I really enjoy having a Prius because it gives me that flexibility about what I drive. Now, that being said, I do have to own the fact that my husband also has a camper van that he loves deeply. When we moved out to the West Coast, that we drive around and we go out and camp in. So, you know, personal question based on your particular family. I also have 3 kids, and that makes a difference in what you drive.
Great and honest responses from both of you. I'll tell you our situation. I too have a 2007 Toyota. It's a Camry and not a pure hybrid. It's called a hybrid. It's got 156,000 miles. It runs like a clock. Perfect. I also have a 2015 Hyundai Sonata. It's got just past 100,000 miles. Our kids are gone and they're off on their own. I would love to buy an electric vehicle. I live in a very rural area of Virginia. The county, this is county, not town. The county has a population of 11,000. So it's a very small and remote county. You have to go 45 miles to get to the nearest charging station. We have decided that as much as we would like to buy an electric vehicle, this is not the time or place for us to do that at this point. I think also one can make a reasonable argument in many cases, not all, but in many cases, the soundest thing to do for the environment, including the climate, is to run your current vehicle into the ground. Because the mere manufacture of a whole bunch of new EVs is itself going to be energy intensive, and it's going to create lots of environmental problems, including some climate problems. So I think there are lots of trade-offs, and I think it is an individual decision in so many cases, influenced by things like how many kids, how far to the nearest charging station, how many miles do you drive a day, a year, a week, economics, all sorts of things. So I think it's a personal decision. For us, it's not the time to buy one, I regret to say. Let me ask a question that was asked by one in the audience, and I'm not sure which of us, I know it's not me, wants to take a stab at this one. Can we anticipate more or less deep seabed mining as we pursue the rare metals that are going to be needed? Is that going to be part of the answer? More deep seabed mining? Pass.
This is not something I've looked at in detail at all either. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but all I can say is something that was told to me early in my career by a renewable developer, and this was probably 12 years ago when renewables were like, still questionable if they were going to get to scale, which seems kind of crazy when you think about it today, but is that there's actually no green source of energy. Everything comes with a cost. And so we're going to have to make some real decisions on trade-offs, whether we talk about deep sea bed mining or other types of mining or extraction. It's really about we're going to have to make policy choices about how we want to get our energy and what sources we want it to come from.
Yeah, I personally have not looked at great extent at deep seabed mining in years. My guess is that it's not going to be more in the short run. It's going to be difficult even where it's allowed, and that it's unlikely to be a ready solution to the challenge of getting the rare metals we need anytime soon. I can imagine it'll be fraught with politics like everything else. A question, lots of good comments have come in. I hope Shelley and Megan will feel free to jump in on any of those comments I see pouring in right now.
Well, there's a range of questions, lots of them about Chevron, and I don't know if one of you wants to, we haven't really talked too much about low bar bright and relentless. Shelley, you brought it up, so I don't know if you want to address any of those. They're in the Q&A and not the chat.
I think if I can chime in, I think it'd be great if one of you addressed Chevron at more depth than we have. I've heard, and I'll throw this out as raw meat, I have heard that as a result of Chevron and other court decisions that have been made in recent years, EPA has been rendered, the phrase I hear is defanged or toothless.
I'm going to go ahead and disagree with that.
I was going to say, I'm sure it may not be either. But.
Yeah, I mean, look, I am someone who litigates against EPA often. Just in full disclosure, anyone who looked at my bio would say that, and I don't feel that that's a fair characterization. Is it a sea change in how judges are going to examine laws? Absolutely. Might it result in a greater patchwork of decisions, less consistency among judges in certain circuits, or may you see litigants looking to go file in certain jurisdictions that they feel are favorable to them? Sure, but at the end of the day, we are still going to have things like Skidmore deference come into play, where judges do consider whether or not the agency's rationale is persuasive. And we are still going to have the same we are still going to have someone make an interpretation. And there's also a lot of places where EPA has really traditional authorities. Dealing with the Clean Air Act, I always look to Title I. I used to teach a Clean Air Act seminar course back when I was in DC. And if you look at the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and the authorities that are actually included there, they're exceptionally broad, and they're very bedrock, and they deal, yes, with criteria pollutants, but as you said earlier, Bud, when you're reducing one type of pollutant, you usually have co-benefits with another. So I would disagree that EPA is being defanged. I also think the focus on EPA is overly myopic because Chevron applies for a ton of agencies. I mean, this is not an EPA specific ruling. And I remind everyone that industry is not the only person who files suits challenging agency actions. These suits are also filed often by environmental organizations. And so at times, Chevron, depending on where you sit, could be both a sword and a shield. So it's changed the playing field for everyone. But I guess I tend to be less up in arms than some folks. But Shelley, please disagree with me. I know people have a lot of very different feelings about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably land somewhere between your characterization and Bud's characterization. And I think maybe I've been trying to think about the reaction here. And I think that one of the things that maybe is useful to do is to parse a few different things that are going on in the federal courts, right? Like, on the one hand, what you've seen is a pretty extreme rightward shift in a lot of the circuits in terms of appointments. Trump had a wave of judicial appointments that just really changed the character of the federal court system. So that's going on in the backdrop. And obviously, it's related to the decision to overturn Chevron. And so I think what you have here is Loper Bright Relentless basically says, to paraphrase, like, we're not going to be as trusting of agencies and their expertise and their democratic pedigree as courts have been in the past. We think that it was wrong to give agencies as much leeway as we did. Now, you could imagine a system in which most of the judges on the bench didn't share that temperament and said, actually, like, we're big believers in expertise. And so even if Skidmore reigns and we have to evaluate, like, how considered was a decision and how much expertise was involved and how long-standing, we would still defer. I think given the character shift in the judiciary recently, it is likely to be the case that judges are going to use the demise of Chevron to be less trusting of deference to agencies. Now, whether that's good or bad, and I think this is like a nice nuanced point that Megan is making, depends on whether or not you like what agencies are doing, right? So if you think that the agencies are doing good, impactful work under, perhaps creative but reasonable readings of their statutes, then you should be really worried about the demise of Chevron deference, particularly in this system. If there's another universe out there in which agencies are trying to rapidly reverse actions and you really hate the new direction that they're going, maybe you're not so mad about the end of Chevron deference, although you're still contending with Force One, right? Which is just a really different looking judiciary today than we had not so long ago. So I think it's helpful to sort of like think about how these trends interplay.
I think someone was good enough to put up a link to further information on Chevron. I'm a little bit leery about how much our audience knows about Chevron. It's not the oil company we're talking about. So directly at least. So I think I am not familiar with that particular link, but read up on Chevron if you have any interest in rulemaking at the federal level versus more emphasis on the judiciary rather than the executive branch.
Something that's interesting about Chevron is it actually grew out of a case that involved defending an EPA policy that was actually considered industry friendly under the Clean Air Act, which was the bubble concept for how they were looking at emissions. So if you're interested in Chevron, it has a very interesting history as a case. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add, like, I also think another interesting thing about Chevron is that because of when it came about, I think it was decided in '84, right? So Reagan's implementing a pretty extreme agenda of deregulation in the environmental field and beyond at that time. And so Chevron is the basis on which a lot of courts have read deregulatory authorities into agencies' statutory powers, right? And so, like, I think it's just going to be a really interesting new world to see, like, how much does it unsettle many of these settled interpretations of how much freedom agencies, like, let me just give you an example that's very close to my world. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has basically radically restructured the electricity system, including creating electricity markets under authority that the Supreme Court has never actually blessed, but was always thought legitimate based on Chevron. And, we'll see what happens. I think if nothing else, it's just going to throw a lot more uncertainty into the system, right? And I think part of what's hard about that is that, like, when you think about what developers of clean energy technologies want, they don't want a lot of risk and they don't want a lot of uncertainty. And so to the extent that you're just worried that you're going to be in a game of, like, litigation ping pong and political ping pong going forward, that's not great for the kind of rapid trajectory that we want to see on clean energy.
And Shelley, can you clarify this point? My understanding is the Chevron decision will apply to federal rulemaking well beyond the environment. This isn't just limited to EPA, but rather will extend to FDA and SEC and a whole bunch of other agencies. Is that correct?
That's totally right. Yeah. So this is like a generic decision about the ways in which courts interact with federal agencies.
Thank you. Let me ask Megan a question. Megan, sometimes the states and state actions in the climate area are seen as a prod or a step forward, if you will, in the absence, again, if you will, of federal regulatory action. So my question is, would a more aggressive federal activity on climate lead to more state action following it, or would it have the effect of say, well, now the feds are doing it, we don't have to do it in the individual states?
I am not going to make broad generalizations among the states because they are all unique. What I will say is if you look back historically from about 2000 to, let's say, 2022, there is, if you chart out some of the major statutes, it does usually follows the trend within that period that when you had a more constrained federal government, states enacted more of the climate laws, or we had huge spurts of sweeping litigation come up, like the first round of cases that led to AP versus Connecticut, and then a slight reduction. Again, these are way too broad sweeping generalizations, somewhat of a reduction, and then an increase again during a subsequent conservative administration. However, I want to emphasize that while people will look at some of the higher profile pieces of laws or legislation, like a cap and trade program that came out in 2006, or the clean energy, some of these CES, these 100% clean electricity laws that came out during 2016 to 2020, there have been renewable portfolio standards in well over half the states, including in states that are considered red, that have really significantly moved the needle towards achieving some of the significant reductions that have happened in the electricity sector. And those have been consistently going on, sort of growing throughout that entire period. So, but I really hesitate to say that, you know, if we continue with the Democrat, we will have less state activity, and if we have a Republican, we'll have more, although there, in my personal opinion, I do think when we have a Republican president, we do have certain states lean in harder on legislation within their boundaries.
I mean, I think you're being careful and fair, and that's exactly right. I would just note, I think that there's like a little bit of a difference when we're thinking about pollution control kinds of laws, where when the federal government basically like abdicates responsibility, the states sometimes pick it up. And a federal statute like the Inflation Reduction Act, which kind of the goal is to just make it all cheaper so that states that want to go further can, right? So I think that like when you see a bunch of states that have aggressive offshore wind mandates now, that is like fueled by the Inflation Reduction Act, because it means that they can do it more cheaply than they would otherwise be able to, right? So I think some of this is like about the particular dynamics of how these laws either like synergistically come together or work more as substitutes.
Shelley, I had a question I'd like to ask you too. Shelley, it strikes me that one of the approaches IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has taken virtually since its beginning was to try to get all, 200 countries? To get all 200 countries on board, giving any one or small number of countries the capability, the ability, maybe even the inclination to halt or slow progress. Would things that be further along if we had decided from the beginning to go with, let's just get the top 24 or top 36, whatever the number is, of major emitters of greenhouse gases. Let's get them on board. And it's much easier to corral 24 cats, if you will, rather than 200 cats. Would that have been a better approach? And are we paying for not having taken that from the start?
That's like a really very difficult, like, historical contingency question that I feel ill-equipped to answer. Like I don't know if things would have looked different, right? Like, I guess here's what I'll say. I think that the IPCCC process, the IPCC, the UNFCCC process, I think it's actually really valuable to get everyone together and have those discussions and try to come to some sort of consensus-based mechanism. I think it is obviously insufficient in every way, right? And so, like, there's no reason that you can't get smaller climate clubs together to do things, on top of the IPCC process, which is basically at this point just like a nice game of promises, right? Like, I hope it amounts to something, but at the end of the day, it's like a background low level amount of agreement that isn't impeding additional agreements, right? So I think that, like, the Kyoto Protocol mechanism was maybe like an ill-advised long-term distraction from a way that would actually work. I think that now that what we're talking about is just sort of like a baseline level of trying to establish trust, there's no reason that you can't do exactly what you're talking about on top of it, right? Now we've started to see this happen a little bit, right? Like, you're seeing some countries get together and talk about, like, how to collaborate on carbon border adjustments, without trying to get total global agreement. So, had we started there, I don't know. It's a global problem, and I think that having some baseline level of global consensus is a good thing, and it's obviously insufficient at this point.
Thank you. Do either of you have a question for each other?
I don't know. I really liked Shelley's answer about how the state and federal programs are different and work together versus substitute and synergy. I was like, I agree with that. I guess, Shelley, one thing that I'm really interested in is the European programs and the changes that they're going through this year. So I don't know if you've been looking at those and have any thoughts. You mentioned going into the cross-border adjustments, but I think those programs are really interesting.
I agree. I think they're interesting, but I work on US domestic stuff, so I won't
me too.
prognosticate too much about that. I'm just looking through the questions to see if there's any. Okay, so here's one maybe that's a good one for you, Megan. Do you have thoughts on cap and trade versus carbon taxes?
Yes.
Maybe I'll broaden it, like, to versus other mechanisms, right? Like, I really liked the way that you went through and said, like, we're looking at all of these different types of mechanisms with different types of compliance instruments. Do you have thoughts on what's working best?
Yeah, so I am also shaped in my opinion based on when I started practicing, because when I started practicing, one of the first things I did is cap and trade legislation was everywhere in the federal government. It was right after California passed AB 32. And the idea was there were lots of bipartisan cap and trade programs that were being considered. And I have to say, I think anything at the federal level that's consistent between either a cap and trade or a carbon tax would be great, because one of the problems that we really have in the state by state patchwork is without scale, and that's why it's so important in that discussion of linkage, you do have a lot of unintended consequences or inefficiencies in the market. And the thing about a carbon tax, I'm slightly biased, but Secretary Baker, James Baker, had a carbon tax program idea at one point that had been proposed where there was a tax collected and then it was refunded to Americans through the annual refunds. So you were still sending a price signal, but without really having those same impacts. And one thing that can get lost in this conversation about climate, because of the discussion of the science and so on, is what it means to actually implement these policies when you get down to the specific home or business. And again, I feel, Shelley, like you were talking about, I feel very privileged for where I sit, but I'm also very aware that not every family has that. And there are a lot of impacts. I grew up in a very small town, and people for whom $5 on their utility bill is a big deal. or, my sister rations gas when she drives out in town. So we do have to look at how these programs can work cost effectively. And I do think when you go to a national level program, it is going to be more efficient at achieving reductions more cost effectively, whether that's going to be a tax or a cap and trade. And I want to point out with that question, that's different than a tax incentive. So when you're talking about a nationwide carbon tax, that's different than sort of the piecemeal tax incentives that we have now. So I don't know if that helps answer the question. And again, just personal views on this call.
There's another good question about the environmental justice impacts of some recent laws and regulations that maybe we want to say a word about. I for one, I'm like really intrigued by what I've described in other places as like a new theory of environmental justice that accompanies the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So they passed this Inflation Reduction Act, and basically the way that it works is there are these clean energy tax credits, and you can get a base credit just for doing the thing, but you get more credits if, in addition to that, you pay prevailing wages and you incorporate apprenticeship requirements. So basically, like, if you have good labor practices and you're helping to build the workforce of the future and pay them well, you're going to get a bigger tax credit. And then you get even more of a tax credit if you locate in energy communities and historically disadvantaged communities, right? So if you're building whatever project it is that you're building in these communities, then the tax credit increases, right? So this is an incentive to accompany your clean energy project with high labor standards and to put it somewhere that's been historically disadvantaged or burdened by energy. Now, I think that this is like just deeply questionable from an environmental justice perspective. On the one hand, if communities want this infrastructure, then great. The question then becomes, though, like, how do we make sure that like all of the environmental justice sins of the past aren't just replicated when we do clean energy infrastructure going forward? And so there's a bunch of safeguards that the administration has tried to put into place with particularly IIJA Act, so Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act programs where they're funding some of the like more carbon intensive infrastructure like hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, where they've asked developers to come up with community benefits plans and figure out, how do you make sure the community wants this? How do you make sure the community benefits from this? But I do think like as we enter a new era of clean energy infrastructure development, being careful about the tools that we use and community assent and like figuring out how we do EJ a lot better with this huge new raft of infrastructure development that we like undeniably need is going to be a really important question.
Anything else from either of the panelists? Let me express my thanks to both of you. It's been fun getting to know you online, remotely from Zoom at least, and I appreciate your contributions. Can I pass the baton back to Madison or to Sarah at this point?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to our amazing speakers today. We so appreciate all of you taking the time and energy to be with us and share your knowledge with our audience. And again, thank you to our audience for attending summer school and for all of your great questions. Sorry that we couldn't get to many of them, but we appreciate your engagement. And please do remember to register at the link in the chat for our networking reception, which is taking place next Monday in DC. And please check out our final 2 sessions of summer school on environmental justice and hazardous waste and sites. If you couldn't attend the full webinar today, the recording will be posted on the event webpage within a few business days. If you want to check out our previous summer school sessions, the recordings are up for those as well. We hope to see you at future programming, which can be found at eli.org. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thank you.